So, in this section of chapter 9, general and special senses, I've broken this into just the visual aspect of the presentation. So, we're talking here about vision, your eye, the things that allow us to interpret light, and some of the issues that we may have um, in interpreting our environment. So, to get started, some of the accessory structures of the eye that we should take note of is the fact that we've got the carbuncle here. This area is the lacrimal carbuncle. This will help to filter out because up in the lateral portion of the eye, we have the lacrimal gland that is going to secrete our tears, and so the lacrimal carbuncle is going to help filter that fluid out. And we'll talk about where that will go in a moment. Our eyelashes are there to protect our eye as well as the eyebrow itself. So, contrary to any advice you may hear to shave them off or that they are not necessary, they are in fact helpful to keep things from falling into the eye as well. Other things that you should take note of is the canthias. These are the uh, angles both on the lateral and the medial side. That is where the eyelids are coming together. And then we'll talk more in depth about the components of the eyeball as we go forward. So, speaking of that lacrimal gland again, so that's at that lateral aspect of the superior side of the eyeball. That is going to secrete through the lacrimal gland ducts. Again, it's a gland. So, what does it do? It secretes things. And what is it secreting? It's secreting our tears, and that is keeping our eyes from drying out. And of course, is overactive when we are in an heightened emotional state. Um, the carbuncle again has the lacrimal pores that are going to help the fluid that flushes from the superior lateral side across the the eyeball towards the medial nasal area and is going to drain into the superior and inferior lacrimal canal. That those Both of those canals are connected to the lacrimal sac, right right in the inside of the nasal and eye juncture there. And that sac is then connected to the nasal lacrimal duct. The nasal, nasal lacrimal duct is going to drain inferiorly into the nasal canal. So if you ever wondered, why is it that when you are heightened and you have your eyes leaking all over the place and then suddenly now your nose is leaking, that is because the duct is connected from the eye into the nasal cavity to drain any excess fluid from our tears. So, if you were ever wondering or needed a good, fun trivia fact, now you know your eyes are connected to your nose. Speaking of how the eyes function, there are 6 muscles in the human eye that help us to move our eyeballs in different directions so that we can observe our external environment. These are really very simple, actually, when you break them down. And there is a table on 355 that, if you're a table kind of person, 355 breaks it down really simple. Um, but let me help you break it down because it's actually kind of, kind of sensible when we break it down. Instead of going, oh my gosh, there are six and I just have to memorize them, let's just break them down into their names, their anatomical names, and then we'll talk about their functions, because form follows function, right? So some of the four of the mm, four of the eye muscles are termed with lateral, medial, superior, and inferior. So think about, okay, lateral, medial, superior, inferior. So you kind of now know where you're going to find these, right? Just knowing our directional terms. And the latter part of the term is rectus. A rectus muscle is a straight muscle. So these are just straight, their fibers are straight. So if I am a lateral rectus muscle, I'm a straight muscle that is on the lateral side of the eyeball. So think about, what is that muscle going to do when it contracts? It's going to move my eyeball to the lateral side. Simple. Now you can apply that to the other three. The last two muscles of the eyeball are the inferior and superior oblique muscle. Again, in superior, inferior, you know where we're going to find these muscles. And oblique means that it goes across at a diagonal. So the superior and inferior oblique muscles, the superior oblique muscle pulls the eyeball across so that um you look down and lateral. So down and lateral. Yeah, you probably can't see, but down and lateral. That's your superior oblique. The inferior oblique is going to pull and pull your eye towards the medial side. So rotating it towards the medial side and upward. So those are probably the two that you'll have to work to commit to memory. You kind of have to think about. And what I like about this image is that the form of the muscle, the obliques, they are formed so that their fibers are, again, the lateral is going to rotate my eyeball towards the medial side, and it's going to go upwards. So I'm going to be looking towards, I don't know if you can see it, but I'm crossing my eyes and uh looking towards my nose. Um, so the lateral and superior oblique, you might have to take a little second to make a flashcard and the directions, but in general, oblique is going across, inferior, superior, you know where you're going. And in a multiple choice, you'd be able to deduce if it's not lateral, it's oblique, and if it is rotating the eyeball in the upward and um, medial direction, then it's probably an oblique. An oblique is a little bit more sophisticated, we'll say. And here is another image to help you, if you're a visual person, to understand how these muscles, when they contract, the directions that they are taking the eye, so that we can focus on um, various locations in our environment. Now, again, going back to our nervous system, there are four, or no, I'm sorry, there are three cranial nerves that are innervating the eyeball to help us with motor. The first one is the ocular motor uh, nerve. The ocular motor nerve is cranial nerve number 3. It is going to innervate the inferior, both the inferior rectus and the inferior oblique. So that's one way to know those. And the other one that it's going to the other two that it's going to innervate is the medial rectus and superior rectus. So let's keep it sim. It's superior rectus, the inferiors, both rectus and oblique, and then your medial rectus. Sim. SIIM. Sim. And then you're left with just 2 more muscles that are innervated by 2 other cranial nerves. So you have the trochlear nerve. And look at this image. The trochlear nerve is going to innervate the superior oblique muscle. It is it is held by a trochlea, which is just if you had a pulley system, the trochlea is that part that is anchoring the rope that you are pulling over. So your trochlear um, cranial nerve number 4 is the is going to innervate your superior oblique muscle. And then lastly, the one that I don't have a great shorthand for, but hey, it's the last one, is the lateral rectus, and that is the abducens uh, cranial nerve number 6, abducens, lateral rectus. So let's talk about the components of the eyeball, the structures that make up the eyeball. We have 3 layers because we love threes, right? And each of these layers are going to be one part in the posterior side, and they are going to become different parts um, in the anterior side. So let's talk about the cornea, or I'm sorry, not the cornea, the sclera. The sclera is the outermost layer of the eyeball. The sclera is the outermost layer, and it is a tough structure. It's a fibrous layer. It's very tough, which is great because it provides support and protection. It attaches the muscles, the optic muscles are going to attach to the sclera. It is going to help the eyeball to move into to focus. The the sclera is going to become thinner as it comes to the anterior side. So the sclera is thicker on the posterior side, and then as it becomes anterior, it becomes thinner, and it becomes known as the cornea in the front part of where the light will enter in the eye is the cornea. So if I were to ask what is the layer that is continuous that becomes the cornea, you would say the sclera. The surface has small blood vessels and nerves that penetrate the sclera that help to reach internal structures of the next uh, following layer. But the cornea, the part where the light goes through the eye, that has no blood vessels and no nerve endings. Or I'm sorry, not no nerve endings. It has no blood vessels. No blood vessels. Um, so the cornea is going to get the nutrients and oxygen that it needs from that lacrimal gland that secretes our tears when we're overactive. But when we're not overactive, it's just secreting nutrients, oxygen, nutrients for the cornea. The the middle layer of the eyeball is the choroid. The choroid is the middle layer. It's also known as the vascular layer. Um, it is going to supply blood vessels, lymphatic vessels. It is going to help regulate the amount of light that comes in because on the posterior side, this layer is the choroid. But as we move anteriorly, it becomes the ciliary body. And the ciliary body is going to help keep is going to help. There are ciliary muscles that are going to help contract so that the lens will focus, either becoming more focused or less focused, as well as becoming one with the iris, which we all attribute to our eye color. And that iris is a muscle that is going to allow either more or less light into the back of the eye. And in addition to all of that, the choroid is going to secrete our aqueous humor that is going to stay on the inside, the anterior chamber of the eye. So the anterior chamber is everything, is this area before the lens on the anterior side. And that aqueous humor is very important because it's going to circulate again nutrients around the anterior chamber of the eyeball. It's also um uh we talked about the choroid in the posterior side, the ciliary bodies on the anterior side, and the iris on the anterior side as well. We talked about the uh, ciliary muscles, the ciliary papillary muscles that contract, that will hold or that will allow um, the iris to contract or to dilate to either open or close that pupil. Now that pupil is nothing more than a space that light will travel through. It's just the opening. The pupil is an opening. It's not a physical structure. It's the opening that light will enter in. And then finally, we have the innermost layer of the eyeball. Is on the posterior side here. We've got the retina is the innermost layer of the eyeball. Now, the retina is a neurotissue. It contains our photoreceptors that are going to interpret light, and it is going to there's going to be some, as you can see here, some vessels that are also going to innervate this neurotissue to help support our photoreceptors. Now, the photoreceptors, again, they are interpreting what is the light that is coming in. There are two types of photoreceptors. There are the rods and the cones. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about um, those internal photoreceptors on the next slide. Oh, nope. On this slide, this is just a more simplistic description or image of what we just talked about. So here you can see that this is looking from a superior view. If I were just to cut the cranial vault off and I was just looking down, this is helping you to see how light is going to enter into the eye. It's going to hit the fova, which is going to be the point of maximal and focus interpretation. This is where we want our images to land. The other structures that we should note here is the optic disc. The optic disc is where we have the entrance of the optic nerve and the blood vessels that innervate the retina. On that optic disc, we actually do not have any photoreceptors at all on the optic disc. So this is actually considered a blind spot, which is really interesting. And there is a demonstration in your book on 359. If you use this image in figure 912 as an exercise, you'll be able to identify your blind spot. It's pretty wild. But literally, we see nothing, and our brain is smart, I guess, and interprets the rest of the input and just kind of fills in the blanks. So, as that retinal tissue converges to the posterior side of the eyeball, It becomes, since it is neurotissue, it actually becomes the optic nerve. So the retinal tissue is the optic nerve. Now, there is no attachment of the retina to the back posterior side of the eyeball. The only thing keeping the retina attached to the back side of the eyeball is the vitreous humor. Vitreous humor is um, it's a consistency. The way I describe it is I made Jello, I set it, I pulled it out to have some, but I forgot to put it back in the fridge. And a little while later, I realized it. And I looked at the Jello, and it was, some of it was liquefied, but some of it was still solid consistency. So it's that bridge between a liquefied and a solidified jello. It's that type of consistency. And that is the only thing keeping the retina pushed back up against the eyeball. In addition, that vitreous humor is going to keep the eyeball and give it the structure from the inside to keep that eyeball globe round in character. So again, that retina is going to converge to the posterior part of the eye, and it is going to form the optic nerve. Optic nerve then is, recall from our nervous chapter, it is cranial nerve number 2, our optic nerve. We have 2 eyeballs, 2 cranial or 2 optic nerves, and that's one way to remember the cranial nerve, um, number 2, optic nerve. Now, the other part of this image here is showing that fova that I was telling you is where we want our light to hit. This is where we have the sharpest vision. We have an abundant number of cones in this area that helps us with the sharpness of that vision. And so that is where we would want the light to enter the pupils, go through the lens and hit that fova where we've got an abundance of those cones for vision. Now, we've talked about the optic disc. The optic disc is your blind spot. So I'm going to show you that exercise. And I think it's the coolest thing to go ahead and try this exercise on 359, figure 912. It's fascinating to experience it, and then to realize that your brain is actually filling in the blanks here. So this is that demonstration for the blind spot. If you go ahead and take a few moments, it's either in your book 359, figure 912. Give that a moment of your time just to experience what that's like. Your brain just filling in the rest of the information that it's not receiving from that optic nerve or that optic disc, where that optic nerve is passing through the eyeball, back out to the cranial vault towards the brain. So we've talked about the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber just a bit. The anterior chamber, I had said, is everything before the lens. From the cornea to the lens is the anterior chamber. And then the posterior chamber is everything behind the lens to the back of the eyeball, up against the back surface. And what we've somewhat brushed on is that the anterior chamber, or I should say the anterior cavity. and the posterior cavity, because the anterior cavity is subdivided into the anterior and posterior side. And what is dividing this anterior and posterior side is going to be the iris. The iris is going to divide the anterior to the posterior part of that anterior cavity. So and this becomes important with glaucoma, because there are various reasons why the uh, the anterior versus the posterior chamber may cause increased pressure for glaucoma. We won't get into it, but just know that it has to do with the anterior cavity, which again is subdivided into two chambers, the anterior and posterior chamber. But again, that anterior cavity, the divide is between the cornea and the lens, is the anterior cavity. That cavity is filled with our aqueous humor. Remember, I had noted that the aqueous humor is going to be released from the ciliary bodies, is going to circulate around the anterior cavity, providing nutrients and things like uh, oxygen and grabbing waste products and disposing of waste products in this anterior cavity. Now, the posterior cavity it's not equal, right? So it's not an equal. We have a lot of symmetry in the body, and this is another area where we don't have symmetry. We've got the anterior chamber, and then the posterior chamber is what we think of as the eyeball, right? The globe of the eyeball. And this is, again, filled with that vitreous humor, which I talked about, the consistency. And that vitreous humor is giving the eyeball, the globe, that shape of the globe. So that is responsible for the shape. And holding that retina up against the choroid. Again, there was nothing connecting the retina to the back choroid layer. In fact, the only thing that the retina is attached to is the optic nerve as it exits the eyeball. Here you see the lens. The lens is what is responsible for focusing the light. So it will either uh, thicken or thin out to allow for the right amount of reflection through that, so that it lands just ever so perfectly on that fova where we've got that sharp vision. We're not going to dive too far into the focal point, focal distance. There'll be a couple of things that I will just mention, but just understand the lens is responsible for the accommodation, which is the focus of light on the back of the retina. This this is hyphema. Um, this is this is a medical emergency. So in the event that you have a patient that has within that anterior chamber blood, that is a medical emergency. They may, if they are not if they're not taken to higher level of care, this is going to apply a lot of pressure on that anterior chamber, and they may lose their eyesight. So this is hyphemas, and hyphemas are medical emergencies. Again, if you see anything in this anterior chamber, one of the things that we're going to want to do for these patients is to keep them at a 30 to 45 degree angle and get them to a higher level of care. This is cataracts. You probably have heard of or seen. Cataracts is having to do with the transparency of the lens. Not much that you're going to do for them, your patients, but just note that as you are evaluating your patients, if you do see some cloudiness past the iris, that's the lens that has become opaque or cloudy. And this is due to a buildup of proteins over time. And we have surgical treatments for this, excuse me, where we remove the lens and replace them. They can be caused from drugs or sunlight or injuries, but for the most part, it's something that happens over time. Again, like I said, we're not going to talk too much about focal point, focal distance, visual accommodation. I just want you to know that the lens is responsible for focusing the light that is coming into the eye, and the lens is either going to become thicker or get thinner, and it's going to focus and accommodate that light, focus or accommodate that light so that it lands on the back of the retina for interpretation most optimally. Now, there are a couple of refractory problems that we can take note of. For example, myopia. That is nearsightedness, and I always have to think about this. So the way that I can recall this is that when I am close, I can see. So I'm nearsighted. I can see near, but I have a problem far away. And if you can remember myopia as I can see things up close, but not far away, maybe far away is blurry, then if you see hyperopia is the opposite. It's farsighted. So you can see far, but seeing things up close, this is where you'll get people that will have reading glasses as they get older. And a particular word for the hyperopia having to do with age-related hyperopia is presbyopia. Presbyopia is means old man, and so presbyopia is the condition that of farsightedness because of age. If you wanted to test your color vision, some people are unable to identify the number that is in this image here. That is due to certain kinds of color blindness. So this image sort of gets into the weeds of the different layers of the retina and the cones and rods and how they take and interpret the light that is coming through to the back of the retina. We're not going to dive into this. If you have an interest in this, great. This is something that I even have to work at. Um, as far as the molecules and how the physiology of these neurons and how they work. I do want to just mention that in order for us to facilitate our vision, we do need we do need the compound um, uh, retinol. Retinol is synthesized from vitamin A. So things like carrots are high in vitamin A, and it is vital that we ingest enough vitamin A so that we can synthesize the retinol that we need in order um, to interpret and um, basically see. So I do want to make mention of vitamin A. Vitamin A, again, is going to help synthesize the retinol, which is used so, in vision. So for our photoreceptors, vitamin A. So another thing to note is that our sight is not just one direction, right? Part of, let's say, the left eye, the lateral part is going to send information from the lateral side of the eye, and as you can see, it's going to follow the optic nerve. It's going to follow the optic nerve, and it's going to travel to the left side of the optic tract. However, the medial side of the left eye, the medial side is going to travel along the medial part of the optic nerve, and it's actually going to cross at the optic chiasm, which is right. It's in the on the inferior side of the brain, and it's actually going to cross at the optic chiasm, and is going to be interpreted on the right hemisphere um, occipital lobe. So some of our information that we receive from say the left eye, some of it stays ipsilateral being the same side, and some of it is going to cross that optic chiasm and cross to the opposite hemisphere altogether. And the way to remember this is to just know that the medial side, the medial information on the medial, both the left and the right, that's going to cross at the optic chiasm. So the medial information is going to cross to the opposite hemisphere. So injuries to the conjunctiva, you're probably going to think of, somebody who says that they've got something in their eye and they kept, rubbing and scratching, and ultimately it ends up scratching the conjunctiva. This could be a grain of sand that got in, a grain of dust that got in and was agitated, and wasn't flushed out. This will heal. This won't affect sight. It'll heal in a 2 to 3 days. The abrasion will heal. If it is under the conjunctiva, so subconjunctiva, this is where we have some of those blood vessels. We might get some bleeding in the whites of the eyes. Think of maybe a forceful cough or sneeze where we burst one of those blood vessels, or high blood pressure might also cause this. Um, Again, these subconjunctival hemorrhage that a patient may experience is actually going to be painless. It won't affect the vision, and that will resolve within a week or two. Trauma to the eye. This is quite the upper lid laceration. This is going to require some imaging to ensure that the globe is still intact, that the muscles um, are still functional. This is certainly an emergency that requires higher level of care. There's not a whole lot that you can do other than to just guide your patient and to keep them comfortable, keep them from moving and agitating that area, and then just getting them to a higher level of care. Again, this is a facial trauma, so this is going to also need, especially with this black and blue around the orbital, um, we're definitely going to need higher level of care. We're going to need some imaging to ensure that the globe is still intact. Um, and this is a medical emergency, so just keep your patient as comfortable as possible and as calm as possible, and ensure that they get to a higher level of care. And this is going to complete our discussion on the visual special sense, and so we will move on in a different lecture or recording on the special sense of auditory.